It's wonderful to see you all. I'm William McGivern, Dean of the University of Minnesota Law School, and I want to say hello and welcome to the faculty and staff, students, alumni, and friends who are here from the law school and from around the university for today's special Human Rights Day lecture. So I went to see the movie Nuremberg yesterday. I can't recommend the movie, I'm sorry to say. You're better off watching Professor Sadat, I guarantee. But one thing that came across from the movie, amidst some bad acting, was the notion that that pivotal event is the time when our society decided that the rule of law was going to extend to this international human rights field. That an area where law had not been present was a place where we were going to get together and cooperatively make it ourselves. And that spirit from Nuremberg today to today is one that so many thoughtful, hardworking people have contributed to bring us to the point where we now have the international human rights structures that we have today, and that we are continuing to build and continuing to work on all of our, the rule of law here and abroad to make sure that those institutions and those norms remain robust and grow. It's always been an important part of the University of Minnesota Law School, and we don't have events like this without the hard work of the people at the Human Rights Center. I want to particularly recognize the faculty director, Regents Professor Fenula Nielen, and Amanda Lyons, class of 2009, who's the executive director of the center. It's their work that brings this kind of event to the law school, and please join me in thanking them. The Human Rights Center is this hub of research and advocacy and education that's really at the cutting edge of that human rights law and practice that's so very important these days. They work with partners inside the university and well beyond its walls to respond to pressing problems and support both local and national and global human rights movements. And we're so lucky to have them as a part of the law school, and I know for many students as one of the things that made you decide Minnesota law was a place where you wanted to learn about the rule of law. So each year, the center and many supporters join with organizations around the world to commemorate Human Rights Day. And our annual Human Rights Day lecture is an opportunity to reflect on this unique history and mission for us as a globe, for us as a law school, and exchange ideas and broaden our horizons about these human rights movements. So we're commemorating today the 80th anniversary of the opening of the Nuremberg trials and International Human Rights Day, and not for nothing, the 37th anniversary of the Human Rights Center here at the law school. So I'd like to take a moment to welcome our honored guest and next speaker, University of Minnesota Regent Ellen G. Lugar. Please welcome to the Regent, you can come. Regent Lugar's distinguished career in public service includes representing U.S. agriculture in global efforts to improve food security with the United Nations food agencies in Rome. She's also helped with philanthropic efforts in senior leadership roles at the Minneapolis Foundation and at General Mills. And she's served on numerous nonprofit boards, Twin Cities Public Television, the Global Food Banking Network, Wellesley College, and now she's a newly appointed regent, member of our university's Board of Regents representing Congressional District 5. She earned her JD from Georgetown and her BA from Wellesley, but the University of Minnesota is her favorite institution. So please join me in welcoming Regent Lugar.
Thank you. Thank you so much. There are folks who often wonder, what is my connection to the University of Minnesota? But I can tell you one of my most proud connections is that all 4 of my grandparents graduated from the University of Minnesota. And I'm particularly proud of my 2 grandmothers who graduated because that was a time when not many women were going to college. But I'm here today on behalf of the Board of Regents, and it's really an honor to be part of today's celebration of International Human Rights Day. So I want to extend a very warm welcome to all of you attending and to thank our dean and the law school's Human Rights Center for the invitation to say a few words. I think many of you are aware that the Human Rights Center is one of the first of its kind. It advances the university's mission with its rigorous research, dedicated teaching mission, and meaningful support to the human rights community locally, nationally, and globally. And it was an honor to serve at our embassy in Rome, and there I heard a lot about the work that goes on right here in Minnesota. Since the founding of the center in 1988, the center has been really placed extremely well as part of the exceptional and multidisciplinary human rights community here at the law school, across the university, and in the Twin Cities. It's a preeminent research institution with several interrelated priority areas and programs focused on real-world challenges. And sadly, we have too many of those. Students, I believe, benefit from on-campus programming and opportunities for applied research, hands-on experience and professional development, preparing all of you with the commitment and skills to defend human rights. And the center's faculty, staff, and students partner with communities, governments, and institutions to improve human rights law, policy, and practice across the different levels of government. The broad impact has garnered the center with a highly well-deserved international reputation. So thank you again for being here and taking a moment to pause from this very busy season so that we can celebrate International Human Rights Day together. And with that, I'll turn it over to Professor Fionnuala Ní Oileán.
Hi, everyone. It's just great to have a full room after a snowy weekend and Thanksgiving joy, but also students about to face into exams. And I think it's just an attribution of how many students come to Minnesota to do human rights and how many of you will pursue careers in human rights. It is my huge pleasure to introduce Professor Leila Sadat. Professor Sadat is one of the world's leading and foremost authorities in the field of public international law, international criminal, human rights law, and foreign affairs. She has many titles. She is the James Carr Professor of International Criminal Law at Washington University Law School. But in addition to that, she's played really important roles, most recently as the Special Advisor on Crimes Against Humanity to the ICC prosecutor between 2012 and 2023. Most recently, she was appointed as the US expert on the OSCE Moscow mechanism. She has received numerous awards. I want to mention one. It is not only is she a renowned international law scholar, but she's also one of the foremost women leaders of international law. And the American Society of International Law last year recognized her with their Distinguished International Women's Award, which is, I think, a testament to the work she has done over many years and the recognition of that society's acknowledgement of her work. She has more publications than anyone could count. She has an extraordinarily busy life, and at the moment that life is particularly engaged in launching and bringing to fruition the project that she has undertaken in addressing and creating the first International Convention on Crimes Against Humanity. Professor Sadat is going to talk to us about the journey that has taken, both professional and personal, and also to acknowledge the costs, both professional and personal, of undertaking this kind of path-breaking work. So it's my profound pleasure to invite her to address us today. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So great to be here. Okay, can you hear me? All right. I was so tickled to hear. I'm disappointed about the Nuremberg movie, though, because I was going to go see it. But thank you so much, Ellen. Thank you, Fanula. Thank you to the Dean for the warm welcome, to all the alums and the many supporters of the Human Rights Center that I met last night at dinner, to Amanda, who's kind of been shepherding me around from place to place and has organized everything. It's really a pleasure to be here to celebrate Human Rights Day. Tonight I'll fly to The Hague, and I'll go to the International Criminal Court meetings that are taking place this week. The court meets, and the court really is the successor to the Nuremberg Tribunal. The court's facing a lot of challenges. I won't talk about those today, but I could answer questions. 9 individuals sanctioned by the United States and 9 by the Russian Federation. And so we know these are challenging times for human rights. These are challenging times for global justice. These are challenging times for justice in our own country. And the international human rights movement has seen challenges before. And so I suppose my job as chief cheerleader and an entrepreneur in this human rights and global justice space is to say, don't give up on the fight. Just put your feet together, take a step every day, and keep working. So what I'm going to talk to you about today is a project that, and I know they told me there was a clicker. I like to move around. Oh, here it is. Okay. I'm going to talk to you about a project that I started a long time ago when I was young on a new treaty on crimes against humanity. And I've worked on this project since I had a bit of the brainchild for it in 2007, so it's been a few years now. And as an academic, I thought of it primarily as an academic project, but I also wanted to have real-world impact. I've been lucky enough to be on the ground floor when the International Criminal Court was established. I'd seen how treaties are negotiated and how individuals can actually spark change. And I had been privileged to work with many of the people that established the ICC, that really established my field, the field of international criminal law and human rights. And so I thought in 2007, and I'll explain why maybe later, we need a treaty on crimes against humanity. I've done a lot of research on this, and the Nuremberg story is the typical origin story, and I'm going to come to Nuremberg. But before I get to Nuremberg, I want to talk about slavery. Because where we find the term crimes against humanity is originally in natural law and morality in the 17th, 18th, 19th centuries, and it slowly hardens to become international law. That's the same progression that human rights goes through. Things about the dignity of the human person, the rights, the inalienable rights in our Declaration of Independence, in the French Déclaration des droits de l'homme et du citoyen, right, of 1789. Those are natural rights that come from natural law that become international law and international human rights. And the campaign to stop the transatlantic slave trade, which trafficked 13 million people from Africa to the United States and to other places in the Americas, was a global campaign. It was a human rights campaign. And it was interesting, and I really learned this when I did a sabbatical in France in 2011, it was called a crime against humanity, particularly in the French writings. They would call it a crime contre l'humanité. And a crime, it was barbaric, it was immoral. So abolitionists took up the language of religion and morality, and that started to codify into law. And so we had Supreme Court Justice Story riding circuit saying it's contrary to natural law and prohibited by international law and therefore unlawful. And what would happen is when slave trading vessels, after the slave trade was made illegal in the United States in 1819, there were still vessels that were trading. And so they'd be captured and they'd be brought in, and the question is what would happen to the captives. And in the United States, because the United States had made slave trading illegal but not slavery, and because the courts couldn't figure out whether this was law or morality, we had a very challenging situation. That wasn't true in other countries that had entered into treaties to abolish the slave trade and made it clearly illegal and made the interdiction of slaving vessels a form of interstate, what we call now interstate cooperation and mutual legal assistance. And so one of the things that was extraordinary is, as I said, in the United States, contrary to Justice Story, you had Chief Justice Marshall, right? The great Justice Marshall, Marbury versus Madison, who says, it's really repugnant, it's a bad thing. But in the Antelope case, he said, it's not international law because it's not prohibited by a treaty. And what happened, and I'm going to come back to this at the end of my talk, the treaties that the British entered into with Sierra Leone, with the Netherlands, I'm trying to remember now, with the Netherlands, with Germany, with many other European countries, but not with the United States of America, allowed the British to interdict and board vessels and take ashore the captives who would then come before a tribunal in Sierra Leone or Havana, Cuba, or in Brazil, and they would be freed. And so I'm going to talk about, do treaties matter? Does law matter? They sure did then. And we'll see that without a treaty, in terms of international cooperation, in terms of tackling global problems, it's very difficult to do much. So we saw crimes against humanity then emerge in the 19th century as this sort of campaign to end slavery. It also emerges at the beginning of the 20th century in the declaration relating to the Armenians. And it shows up in this preambular paragraph known as the Martin's Clause in the 1899 and the 1907 Hague Peace Treaties. Those treaties actually regulated the laws of war. They didn't deal with crimes against humanity. But there's this language that I love about that people remain under the protection of the law of nations as they are established by the usages of civilized people, the laws of humanity, and the dictates of the public conscience. And that's the infusion of this sort of natural law, natural rights framework into these treaties on the law of war. Why? Because they couldn't predict all the weapons that would be used and all the evil techniques that might arise as war was being waged. And so the preamble was careful to state that the treaty didn't displace the field, that outside the treaty, customary international law continued to protect human beings. And the Martin's Clause is what's used in Nuremberg to give rise to the crimes against humanity charges against the Nazis. If you go to the movie, I guess you'll see Hermann Goering, played by Russell Crowe. But many are familiar, I'm sure if you're attending law school here, you're probably familiar with the Nuremberg trial. There was the major trial of the major war criminals that Robert Jackson of the United States was the chief prosecutor for. It was the four Allied powers, the Soviet Union, France, Great Britain, and the United States, who sat in judgment of the Germans. And so one of the criticisms of Nuremberg, of course, was that it was victor's justice, because what about crimes that had been committed by the Allies? That said, because the trial was generally respected, it was thought to have been fair. They were able to get evidence, for example, about waging unrestricted submarine warfare, which Dönitz was accused of, but he pointed out that Nimitz was doing it for the United States in the Pacific, and he was actually able to get that affidavit and got a reduced sentence. So the Nuremberg trial was important. It kind of set the foundation for modern human rights law, and it set the foundation for modern international criminal law. And crimes against humanity was this gap-filling crime that emerges from natural law, from the Martin's Clause, from the slavery, anti-slavery campaign, to emerge as this is what we're going to call what happened to the Jews in the Holocaust. This is what we're going to call what happened to German citizens being attacked by the German state, because the laws of war didn't cover that. The laws of war couldn't cover what a state was doing its own citizens. It only covered interstate offenses. And so crimes against humanity emerges as this gap filler. And you can see it's a list: murder, extermination, enslavement, deportation, and other inhumane acts. Sounds very much Martin's Clause, right? This idea of barbarism committed against civilian populations before or during the war, or persecutions. And of course, the most radical phrase, whether or not in violation of the domestic law of the country where perpetrated. Imagine that international law reaching deep into a state's legal system and displacing national law and saying what you did is actually illegal internationally. And so Nuremberg is the foundational moment of modern international criminal justice. But we'll see the slave trade in earlier iterations come important too. So after the Nuremberg judgment, we get, and that's 80 years ago now, we get codification of the Nuremberg Principles by the International Law Commission, which is the body that the United Nations established in order to codify and develop international law. It's found in treaties. This idea of crimes against humanity is found in treaties in partial form. The Genocide Convention of 1948, which criminalizes attacks on groups, but not attacks on individuals, and only in very narrow circumstances. The Apartheid Convention and the Torture Convention, and much later, the Enforced Disappearance Convention in 2006. But we never get a treaty on crimes against humanity. We get the Genocide Convention in 48 and the Geneva Conventions in 1949. And I think if you look at that list of crimes and you think of the implications, whether or not in violation of the domestic law in the country were perpetrated, you can see why states were very hesitant to codify this crime. It starts to reemerge in the 90s. Why? Because, and I'm thinking of your Human Rights Center, founded in '88, the year before the fall of the Berlin Wall, the collapse of the Soviet Union. And then we go into the 1990s, which the General Assembly called the decade of international law, because the Soviet Union was gone, the United States was powerful, and the Russians weren't vetoing things, the Chinese weren't vetoing things, and there was this flourishing and construction of international law institutions, the WTO, think of the European Union, how it grows in the 1990s, the International Criminal Court, which is created in 1998, and the establishment of the Yugoslavia and the Rwanda tribunals in response to wars breaking out. There's just a reemergence. There's a great French writer that said Nuremberg was like a dormant volcano, and it re-erupted in the 1990s because all of a sudden this precedent, everybody's studying, everybody's talking about it. And so we get the International Criminal Court statute negotiated, and we get a new codification of crimes against humanity. I was lucky enough to be present in Rome. There were 165 states and 250 NGOs. It was a huge event. It was a 5-week conference, and negotiating this crime for the first time in a multilateral treaty was a huge achievement. You can see it's a longer list because in 1998, they're responding not just to the Holocaust, but to the desaparecidos, right? So you have enforced disappearance. You had the gender campaign for gender justice, rape, sexual slavery, and forced prostitution, forced pregnancy, lots of gender and sexual-based violence. Now we are adding to that reproductive violence, and you can see it's embedded here, but we didn't really talk about it that way in the 1990s. Apartheid, of course, which had already been codified. Deportation was there, but now also forcible transfer and imprisonment. So you can see new crimes emerging to respond to new areas of concern. There's some things left out. Then they had definitions. I won't talk about all the definitions, but when they're codifying in the Rome Statute, of course, states are thinking, because this court can apply to any person in the world if the Security Council refers the situation, states want to make sure they know exactly what is being codified. So the Rome Statute definition of crimes against humanity is much longer, and it has little subparagraphs with additional definitions. And one of the things they add in particular, that it's a widespread or systematic attack against a civilian population pursuant to a state or organizational policy. And it's those elements, what we call the context or the chapeau elements of the crime, that distinguish it from ordinary murders or ordinary cases of sexual violence. It's a compound, very difficult to prove crime. Well, I'm going to fast forward because we don't have all day. So in 2010, we published a group that I started in 2007, and we worked for 2008, 2009. We had conferences, we consulted individuals. This is kind of an iconic photo we took, and I'm going to come back to the photo at the end just because it's fun to see the historic arc. We came together and we wrote a Crimes Against Humanity treaty. Sharif Bassiouni, who was my mentor, who had chaired the drafting committee for the International Criminal Court statute, had talked about the need for this convention, but all the effort went into building the ICC in the 1990s. But now we're in the year 2007, 2008, and we're starting to realize a couple of things. The ICC is not going to take very many cases, and the crimes are continuing. So we have a lack of capacity, and we still have a ton of crimes. And so we really identified what were the legal gaps that this treaty could fill. There are actually 25. I used to run around with my little PowerPoint. Before this treaty process really took off, it was me and my colleagues, and nobody really listened to us. But I said, look, there's no duty to prevent. You want to prevent crimes against humanity. The Genocide Convention has a duty to prevent. That's really important. You can go to the International Court of Justice. If you're taking public international law, you've heard of Gambia versus Myanmar, and Ukraine versus Russia, South Africa versus Israel. All these big cases are possible because of the Genocide Convention. So we need that for crimes against humanity. We need state responsibility. We need interstate enforcement. What about legal entities? What about corporations? There's a big trial in France right now of the Lafarge Corporation, who constructed a cement plant in ISIS-infested Syria and is being tried for crimes in France. What about non-state parties? And the ICC, of course, has this vertical system of enforcement, copying Nuremberg. We need states to cooperate with each other, just like we do for terrorism and drug trafficking and corruption and organized crime. There are over 320 international criminal law treaties, and there isn't one on crimes against humanity, which is one of the 3 core crimes that's the foundation of modern international justice. So we started our advocacy. We wrote our own treaty to show states what it could look like, what would be the elements. These are some of the things. It's still a point of reference. We put a Martens Clause in, of course. And it was built on the idea of normative development, prevention, of punishment, and also of capacity building, because states that are not well-resourced will need assistance, both technical and financial, in order to combat the problem of crimes against humanity and human rights abuses in their country. This is a slide that I call, this is a concept I've developed called the atrocity cascade. And if you've studied transitional justice, you've probably heard of the Justice Cascade by Catherine Sickink, who wrote a very famous book about how justice will cascade from system to system. The bad news is atrocities do too. Atrocities, if not caught and stopped, multiply, right? We say at the ICC that immunity leads to impunity, which fuels cycles of violence. And so what you have is you have human rights violations in peacetime. Many states, all states pretty much have them. There are I heard New Zealand doesn't, but I don't know. That might be the only one ever. Even Denmark has been before the European Court of Human Rights, right? What country doesn't engage in human rights violations? Every country. And they have national systems that hopefully develop that, and you have the whole international human rights system to support that. But then what can happen in peacetime, and this is why crimes against humanity are so important, is it can get systematic. It can become widespread. The state can actually have a policy, or an organized armed group like the FARC can be undertaking these crimes. And then you're actually in criminal law land, where I mostly live, and you get to crimes against humanity. Genocide technically can happen in peacetime, but we don't really see that. It could happen. Genocide is a crime that doesn't require an armed conflict, but you would need that specific intent to destroy a group, and you'd have to have the facts aligning. Then, if crimes against humanity aren't staunched, you get a civil war. And think of Syria, right? Syria was a case in which you had human rights violations. The Assad regime was repressing its population. The people rose up to protest, and he fired on the protesters, right? This wasn't like Tahrir Square in Egypt, where the army was like, no, we're not going to do that. Assad starts a full-scale war, the other side arms, and all of a sudden the entire country is descended into violence. And you're not only looking at crimes against humanity, you're looking at war crimes with the use of chemical weapons and barrel bombs and all sorts of things that are inappropriate, and genocidal pockets of activities. Along the border with Turkey, where the Kurds live, for example, there was an attack that was about to happen to wipe them out because they were Kurdish, and the Turks had frozen the border. And had the Peshmerga not been able to travel across, you would have had a genocide in Kobani. And the Monde said, you know, is Kobani going to be the Srebrenica of Syria? And so what happens is you get these genocidal pockets inside these all-out conflicts, and you just sort of have to wait for everything to be exhausted and everybody to be dead before they seem to get solved. We're hoping Ukraine doesn't end up there, but we're seeing a war of attrition that's horrific in Ukraine. Gaza is a case in point where you had human rights violations that were ongoing, serious, systemic, clear crimes against humanity, then all-out war, and now allegations, obviously, of genocide. And so this atrocity cascade, if you don't do something about it in the early phases, you really can't staunch it later. You wait till the parties are exhausted. So what was very fortunate for us is we had this bright idea, but it wasn't official. It was just like me and my colleagues and saying, hey, let's have a treaty. But then you have to get states to actually adopt the treaty. And as I mentioned, the International Law Commission is the official UN body that codifies a lot of treaties. If you've taken public international law, you've heard the Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties, that's an ILC product. But the ILC had not been very successful recently for a lot of reasons I can talk about. But Sean Murphy, who came to our last conference at the Brookings Institution, heard about this idea, and when he was elected as the US representative to the commission, said, I want to work on this. So this is a picture we took at the Villa Moignet in Geneva. I'm sure Professor Neolane's been there many times. We held a conference to support the commission in its decision whether or not it would fast track this work. Fast track meaning it would take 6 years, not 20 or 30 or 40, right? And victims are dying, so we're trying to fast track the work a little bit. And so the International Law Commission did vote to advance this, which was a very exciting moment. And for several years, from 2013 to 2019, they developed their own project. And they developed a draft. I could talk a little bit about what's in it, but maybe I'll just talk about the stages. They do a full set of draft articles. The special rapporteur, who became Professor Sean Murphy, he submits a report and a couple of draft articles. The commission debates it. It goes into a drafting committee. It then gets published at the end of the year and sent to the UN General Assembly in New York, where it's taken up by the 6th committee. There was a first draft in 2017. Then comments from governments and NGOs. And then in 2019, we got the text of what's actually going to go into the diplomatic negotiations, the 2019 ILC draft articles. And I would go to Geneva. So again, this was kind of a lonely, when you talk about the personal story, it was like me sitting in Geneva with my fellow from my institute and a friend from Amnesty International, Argentina, Hugo Ralba. And Hugo and I were like, are we the only people that believe in this treaty? Now we have declarations with 600 people on them, but it was me and Hugo and Maddie, and we would watch the ILC work, and it was interesting, right? Because I'd never been to the commission to see how it operated, so I got to learn about that. That was fun, and teach my students. And the commission then comes up with its own draft, smaller than ours, 15 articles and a small annex. It takes the Rome Statute definition with some interesting variations I can talk about. It has general obligations. It establishes jurisdiction, a classic international criminal law treaty in many ways. Criminalization under national law, evoking the Nuremberg principles, investigation, extradition, mutual legal assistance, et cetera. So it produces a draft, and then it has to move from Geneva. And then it decides, I forgot about this slide, and I remember when I was doing this PowerPoint, my husband was like, really? It was its 3,499th meeting? And I'm like, yes, it was. And that's how many meetings it took since Nuremberg, right, 1945, to get a complete text of a Crimes Against Humanity treaty into the official forum where it could finally be debated here in New York. So now we're in New York. Geneva was lovely, food was good, nice views. The work is a little slow, but it was interesting. Then you get into New York, and New York is intense, right? All 193 states. Anybody been to UN headquarters in New York? Right? It's beautiful, right? I take my students, they're so excited to go. I went on a 4th grade field trip, and I think that's why I'm obsessed with the UN. But anyway, it's also a messy place with all the states there, and you have to convince them, unfortunately, to adopt by consensus a resolution that can take this into negotiations. And so we got stuck again. We'd been stuck many times before, but we were really stuck in the 6th committee. And we got what they call technical rollovers in 2019, 2020, and 2021, where all the states would make great statements about how we need a treaty on crimes against humanity, and then Russia would say, "Nyet," and the Chinese would dig in their heels, and that was the end of it, and it would roll over to the next year. And so in 2021, I was sitting with Pablo Arrocha, who was Mexico's legal advisor. We're good friends, and a couple colleagues, because by now there were a few of us, okay, sitting, how are we going to get this? And we had states that were really keen on moving forward. And Pablo says to me, we need wristbands. We need swag. So we have wristbands for you guys. But we also needed some really, really good lawyering. And the thing about Mexico is, boy, do they have good lawyers. And so what they came up with was a plan. Instead of waiting for the resolution to get facilitated and then the states who said no to hold up their hands and saying, sorry, we can't go forward unless you guys want to call for a vote, haha, and nobody wants to call for a vote, is they flipped the tortilla. That's Pablo's words, and they deposited the resolution in August and September. And the resolution called for an ad hoc committee that would take this to negotiation in a year. Now, of course, everybody screamed that you're not allowed to do that, and we don't want an ad hoc committee, and we don't want this to happen. And so what we got is a 2-year process. We got Resolution 77/249, which was adopted by consensus, setting out a 2-year process to take a decision in 2024. And that was operative paragraph 7 of that resolution, which was critically important. It still kicked the can down the road for 2 years, but we made the most of those 2 years for advocacy. We started building momentum. There was a possibility of breaking out of this kind of vicious cycle. And then we had a very exciting day on November 22nd, 2024, when we got the next resolution that actually kicked it into treaty negotiations. We had a much better zero draft of that one. We used the same process along with Mexico and the Gambia that were co-leading the coalition. You notice a Global South-led coalition, which is very interesting. WEOG very supportive, the Western European group and others, but very much Global South-led. And we ended up with, over time, and I've tracked this every single year, you can see state support growing. And I'm pretty excited about that because, you know, for years I would go, it was just me and Hugo, and then it was me, Hugo, and Maddie, and then it was, 10 of us sitting in the back of the room, and then it was 20, and now we have a WhatsApp chat with 80 people, and then we did a declaration, and a vase got 500,000 signatures on a petition. And states started to feel that, right? The representatives started to say, hey, this is growing, there's some momentum. And so last year we got Resolution 79/122, which sets out this process for treaty negotiations, which will open on January 19th. And January 19th, I'll be there. I've been in New York a lot this fall, still lobbying for progressive development and some positive things, as well as civil society participation, which is going to be critically important, and which, again, Russia and China want to block. And we just don't know about the US government right now because it's not super supportive, as you can imagine, of this process. So we'll have a 2-week PrepCom in January, a 1-week PrepCom in 27, and 2 3-week sessions in 28 and 29. Not what we wanted, but maybe you get what you need, not what you want, because in 29 we could have a new government in the United States, just saying, and that could be quite useful. And time is terrible for the victims, but it's not bad for building support because this is a global campaign and it can't just come out of St. Louis, Missouri and the UK. It has to be in the Global South. It has to be in Asia Pacific. This was the participation, just to show you, this is a snapshot from my students. We haven't done all the coding yet, but even in 25, when they were just deciding on the dates of the PrepCom, we had a ton of states speaking, and all but 4 were completely positive about the upcoming negotiations. Doesn't mean that they'll do the right thing on substance, but the idea of this treaty has finally taken hold, and it is really going into negotiations. negotiations. So now we have the 2019 draft, and the thing that's going to be really interesting for the lawyers like me who have been working in this campaign is we need to fill some gaps in the draft, because they don't do everything. They don't do things like reservations clauses or how many states do we need for this treaty to come into force, some of the technical things. There are also additions that states really want, and we heard this in New York over 2 years. Sierra Leone wants the slave trade entered into the text of Article 7, right? They want an amendment. They don't want just enslavement, they want slave trade. And that comes from their own deep history with the transatlantic slave trade. And so to get Global South states, to get the Asia Pacific, Vanuatu wants environment to come in. There's a proposal for environmental crimes. There's a campaign for gender apartheid. Afghanistan, the old government, not the Taliban, want that, and women's organizations and gender organizations. And then there's some clarifications. So I have a project now through the American branch of the International Law Association. We're actually doing draft proposals and sending them to states, because states said, give us language. A treaty monitoring body. I know we have too many, and yet we don't have enough, because we have a lot of crimes, and to interpret the provisions of this treaty, we're going to need those institutions in Geneva. You can't always get to the ICJ. It's not always practical. It's expensive, and there are all kinds of difficulties. And so having a monitoring mechanism of some kind is going to be important. So we're working on papers. They're actually up on the website. I'll leave the PowerPoint with Professor Elaine. You can click on it. And this taking us back to Sierra Leone, like, does law matter? You know, these slave courts freed a lot of people. Now, 13 million were trafficked, so maybe 150,000 isn't a lot, but every one of those souls who was saved went on to have a life. And so when we're in this world of global justice, international criminal justice, a lot of people say to me, does any of this matter? These pieces of paper, these laws. I'm like, they don't matter to everybody, but to some people, they matter enormously. We can't save every person. We do what we can with what we have. And without tools, we can't do anything. And I heard a civil society organization say this, you know, this treaty is not going to be just a paper. It is a promise to the survivors that they've been heard, that their harm has been seen, that justice matters. We don't hear that a lot in New York. We hear it occasionally with delegations that speak to their own terrible past, or we hear it occasionally with a delegation that's talking about an ongoing crime, Ukraine, for example. But this is really who this treaty matters for. And then I have to take it back to Nuremberg, right? It was Jackson himself, when he's sitting there in charge of this huge trial for the United States of America, he knows that the judgment isn't going to make, it's, you know, you're gonna outlaw war and it's gonna stop. He's like, but no, it's gonna put the law on the right side of the equation. And that is a critically important point, right? Nobody can say it better than Robert Jackson, which is why I have to quote him. I think what comes down from that 80-year-ago precedent is that we, in our time, are being asked to recommit to the same principles, precepts, ideals that they were. I'll just show you a couple of fun photos and then I'll stop. So in 1900, I'm not from St. Louis, but I've taught at WashU for a long time, so I've sort of adopted it as my home. In 1904, when St. Louis was a major city, it's not anymore. You've seen the movie, right? Meet Me in St. Louis. The Interparliamentary Union actually met there as part of the St. Louis World's Fair in what's now Ridgely Hall on the WashU campus. And they asked Roosevelt to ask the Tsar to convene the Second Hague Peace Conference. And so the 1907 treaty that has the Martins Clause comes right from this room in St. Louis. Well, that was the picture we took when I started the initiative. And then last year, we made T-shirts. I'm the queen of swag. I'm sorry, I'm out of stickers, but I have wristbands. And we invited the two legal advisors from Mexico and the Gambia, Ana Paula, now who's taken over from Pablo, who's actually the advisor to the foreign ministry, and Amadou Jaita. And we invited them back to take another photo to say, hey, we got resolution 79/122. We know we have a 5-year fight ahead of us, and then there's a treaty ratification campaign that has to happen. But for now, it's kind of time to take a victory lap and have some fun in St. Louis. and Minnesota before we plunge right back in and we jump back into technical details and treaty analysis. So anyway, thank you so much for having me, and thank you for listening.
That was not unexpectedly a tour de force. And I think it's just extraordinary to see what a lifetime of work looks like. And I think for the students today, it's also, I think it's really important in these times to think about, we're in really long fights. And Professor Sadat has been in a really long fight where the odds, if you were putting a bet on this treaty maybe 20 years ago, you would have said, this is a real long shot. So I think it's just worth remembering that long shots are worth doing and to have long shots in mind. So we have a couple of minutes for questions. What we've done is collate some questions from students that I'm going to try to ask you. And I mean, I think the one starting question is to say, when these earlier treaties, when we think about the Hague treaties, even the cross-Atlantic slave treaties, we think about in the Nuremberg, the Atlantic Charter were signed, these were very different times. And I think the question to you is, how hard is it to when you are going into this negotiation, how hard is it going to be to do this, given how many humanitarian crises we have? And also just because so many states are not living up to their obligations. And maybe you would reflect on like the moment of doing this negotiation.
Okay, so there are two things in there, right? How do you actually do this? You know, Jody Williams said the success of the landmines campaign was email, right? For me, it's WhatsApp. Everybody's on WhatsApp. So I'm going back to New York next week, and I've got a WhatsApp chat, and we're setting up meetings. And it's not a very perfect system, and there are not enough of us. We're going to need money eventually for a civil society campaign, and we're going to need a voluntary fund to allow states that are under resources to actually attend, because this is all very expensive. So right now we're up against financial resources. That's a big thing that is challenging now because so much money has dried up. Especially in the United States under the current administration. So there's no doubt that things are more challenging in terms of actually being able to do this work than they were when I started. When I started, I had a great budget, I had no problems, and now universities are also feeling the pinch. So we're all feeling pinched, and we're all doing more with less, and whining about it. And I'm super excited about my middle seat in economy flying to The Hague tonight. You know, you just do what you have to do. Think about the victims, right? That's, for me, that's my think about the victims. I'm still like teaching at a great university, living in a beautiful city. So I think the campaign is going to be challenging. The biggest part of the campaign is Global South. Getting their engagement. We're in touch with some African NGOs, but very expensive, those kind of meetings. Amnesty International and some of the human rights organizations have been doing interpretation for some of the webinars. So here's the plus thing is we have a lot more tools. We have Zoom, we have webinars, we have WhatsApp. Jody Williams had email. We have so many other tools that we can use electronically. The Avaz petition was unbelievable. We had 500,000 people. So I think in terms of the negotiations, it's going to be the human-to-human interaction is going to be critically important. It's why I keep flying back to New York to have dinner with people, to have coffee with people. What are your concerns? How can we address those? But we have more tools than we had before, and we're getting more friends because we have momentum. In terms of no states are perfect, no states are perfect, right? I teach human rights law. You teach the Danish cartoons case. You teach every single country has human rights issues. Some are worse, some are systemic, some become criminal in nature. But it's not as if there are many states out there that are white knights and everything. And so what I've felt happen, and this is anecdotal, I don't have like a study for this. What I've been feeling and seeing is that the atrocities happening in Ukraine and in Gaza have actually galvanized states to support this treaty. The atrocities, for different reasons, right? Ukraine, it's all the Western countries, right? Europe and France and the Baltics are hysterical about what's happening for good reason. And Ukraine's actually going to be on the Bureau. Gaza defanged the Arab group. It got Iran to sort of say, okay, maybe this treaty would be a good idea. Palestine has a very active delegation in New York. They're very effective in their advocacy. And I think to see the Arab group, Saudi Arabia, coming in support of this treaty, whereas they had been one of my 15 coded red for years. And I think states are recognizing the inhumanity, the barbarity. Now, they may not live up to the treaty. They may not ratify it. They may try to water down the provisions during the negotiations. They may try all kinds of tricks. But what I felt in that room, we had 2 minutes of sustained applause when that resolution was adopted. And the only country that dissociated was the Russian Federation. You know. Yeah.
So maybe a question there, and this goes to actually the lived reality of crimes against humanity in this moment, which is, of course, there's this long history that you've told us, and the listing of these crimes tells us the kind of essential barbarism of the crimes. But I think one of the questions to think about is whether crimes against humanity in this century, particularly the technological underpinning, we're perhaps seeing it most acutely in both Gaza and in Ukraine, is changing the essence of the conduct of the crime or the crimes. And I guess I wonder how you think about the ways in which the actual exercise of crime is being shaped and warped by new technologies.
So the technologies make the crimes easier to commit.
Yeah.
Right? And some of the technologies make it harder to prove individual criminal responsibility because they can distance the operators of the technology from the situs of the crime. Other than that, honestly, you know, at the ICC, it's not changing very much of anything. There's still the crimes. You're still proving the actus reus. You're still proving the mens rea. You're still proving, it's just a different technique of committing the same crime. Where I think there's some interesting things, the prosecutor's going to roll out a new policy on cybercrime. And there are ways to commit the crimes now using computers or using other things. Environmental crime is a new area that I think we're going to see a lot of development in. I think the technology is just, again, it's cutting both ways. We're also using a ton of digital evidence at the ICC, digital platforms where now we can actually create a simulation of an atrocity site and use that and show that in court so the judges can see what it would have looked like. Now, the defense lawyers don't like that because the defense lawyers are like, you're fabricating this whole thing. So that's been, so there's some interesting uses of technology in court that are actually helping with prosecutions, just as some of the technology is making it harder for us to establish that chain of causation, that linkage evidence that links the perpetrator to the actual site of the crime. Yeah. I mean, I think for us, these are very practical questions.
So the final question as we come up to the hour is, it's maybe twofold. One is, of course, we're sitting in the United States, and in some ways for us here in Minnesota, human rights at home is a huge motif of what we do at the center, what we do at the university, what we do in the state. But also thinking about the United States as both as a site of a place in which crimes against humanity historically are a relevant prism of understanding or situatedness on this territory and the peoples who have inhabited this territory long before us. But also the US's actions overseas. And I guess I'd ask you to think about both what are the consequences of this treaty for the United States if we come to fruition, but also what can US lawyers and human rights actors, including students and others in this room, do to help you get this treaty over the line?
Okay, well, we don't expect the United States to ratify this treaty. All we've hoped from the United States is that it would leave us alone. right? That was the mantra, is just please let the US government leave us alone. During the 4 years of the Biden administration, we actually got good support in New York. We had a great delegation. They were part of the core group. They were supportive. But even that said, we would never expect the United States of America to ratify that when the US doesn't ratify anything. So I think the ramifications of the US position on human rights treaties and other treaties is that it's going to be very challenging, even well-meaning. Let's say you had a delegation in New York led by very able negotiators with truly good-hearted intentions. It's going to be hard for them to get anything they want because states are just going to look at the United States and say, you guys don't ratify anything. Why should we concede anything? So the strong-arm tactics will be pulled out, I think, by this administration. That will make it challenging for some small states during the negotiations because there will be pressure. It's really hard. So the consequences of the treaty itself for the US, because the US won't ratify, it's hard to say. Most states, 125 states, already have ratified the Rome Statute. Crimes against humanity are in the Rome Statute. Crimes against humanity are illegal under customary international law. So not ratifying the treaty doesn't mean that the US gets to commit the crimes or that groups in the US get to commit the crimes. They're illegal peremptory norms of international law, right? Just making that clear. What the treaty gets you is the interstate cooperation. Now, a carrot for a country like the US is, in most years, we're a country that's welcoming to immigrants. And the Department of Homeland Security had estimated, one of our studies showed about 1,500 people living in the US who could credibly have been accused of crimes against humanity, but we had no legislation to prosecute them. The only thing we could do is deport if they had lied on their visa applications. So potentially, the US could become part of the interstate cooperation network where we would criminalize in our domestic legal system so our own courts could actually adjudicate cases. We have charged a few Russians with war crimes in Ukraine. There are a couple of genocide and torture cases now. So the US can use these core crimes to prosecute in its legal system if it wants to, just the way we could prosecute terrorism or transnational crime or money laundering or any other crime. So the question, I think the existential question for the United States and for all you young people and all of us is, do we want to be part of the world or do we think we're separate from the world? I think it's a lot more fun to be part of the world and to cooperate with other like-minded states in creating networks that can generate positivity, economic benefits, peace and security, and human rights. That would be my goal. And this treaty movement is part of that. We have two hegemons fighting us, maybe three, because China is very negative as well. And the question is, do we shrink from trying to go forward because the hegemons don't like it? I think the answer is we double down and we work even harder to try to push our values out so that they can be the world that we want to live in. That's my personal view. I have 3 kids. I want their world to be a better world than my world was, not a worse world. And I think we're all feeling we're on the precipice of it getting worse rather than better, if we're not already there. And so I think this treaty campaign is so popular because it is also harnessing that energy of people standing up all over. We have Asia Justice Coalition, Africa Legal Aid, organizations in Latin America, organizations in Europe, in the United States saying, enough, stop the atrocities, stop the human rights violations. So that's my hope, right?
Can we give a warm Minnesota thank you to Professor Sadat?